Good morning or afternoon or evening whenever you are listening to these lectures. I would like to continue with Chapter 1. I would like to talk in this lecture about some of the factors that influence the development of sociology, and then go into some of the people who help to set some of the ideas that we see developing even today in sociology. Again, I have listed some of the things that we're going to talk about. We're going to look at some of the factors in Europe that led to the development of this particular discipline, and some others at the same time. Then I'm going to give you a list of people. They're also listed in our textbook. Identify a significant contribution from these people. Most of the contributions I list are the ones in your textbook, but also some additional ones that might help you to understand a little more or a little differently about these group of people. I'll then move to American sociology and finally end up with an example that is not in your textbook, an example of someone in China who actually influenced that country a great deal and has been a global example of sociology. First, let's look at the time period in which sociology developed. Using our sociological imagination, let's connect individuals' actions to the historic period and the social world in which they lived. I'm going to discuss the major concepts and ideas or theories that help sociology to develop. In the 1700s and 1800s, Europe was undergoing a huge amount of change. This time period is generally known as the Industrial Revolution, a time of technological change, and the Enlightenment, a period of intellectual and philosophical thinking that was different from the traditional ways of thinking that preceded them. Not only was technology changing, but challenges to the old beliefs and the orders established by them. The Roman Catholic Church had provided stability, structural order, and identity to Europe for more than 1,000 years after the fall of Rome. Its authority had been challenged by the Protestant Reformation, eventually leading into thinking about science, the rights of the individual, and different types of government structure. By the middle 1800s, both the natural and social sciences were in strong force. Darwin had written his famous book, published in 1859, on the origin of the species, challenging the traditional thinking about the human species. Political thinking changed as well, challenging the traditional authority of monarchies, leading to revolutions in France, Russia, and the United States for individual rights. What is important to the development of sociology is that these social forces, mainly the Industrial Revolution, created changes in the way that people lived. This slide shows us some of the major changes. Certainly the way that people worked changed, in factories rather than on farms. But over time, this meant other changes. People moved to cities, creating these large urban centers, making their own choices about who to marry. The size of families began to change, being educated for the work that was done in factories, and later for social work and other services like doctors and nurses to support the factory workers. And the economy changed too. It was no longer growing the food that you and your family needed and then trading the surplus. Now a new system emerged, capitalism, which focused on profits for those who owned the factories. Workers began to protest against these factory owners for better wages and living conditions, creating what we remember as the union movement in the late 1800s and early 1900s. All of these changes together have been referred to as modernization or modernity, an interesting word, but essentially changing what had happened before the Industrial Revolution to a more modern society. This particular table was taken from another textbook, a textbook by James Henslin, in which he looks at social change. What this slide shows us is a comparison between traditional societies in the middle column and the modern ones on the far right column, those which have experienced the Industrial Revolution and now have advanced to the stage of modernization or modernity, as we called it in the last slide. If you look at some of the characteristics on the far left column, you can see things that we talked about. Family size went from larger to smaller, but the good news is infant mortality, which was high, became very low, as health care, which was based in the home, has now moved to a completely new institution called hospitals. So we're looking at a lot of changes both in the structure and in the behavior of people. So remember this chart as we continue to look at societies around the world today. We have very few of the traditional societies remaining, but there are societies which are in transition even today. With these changes in both the structures of the society and the behavior of individuals, people began asking questions. Why are we seeing these differences? Why is society changing? Why are people changing? Of course, this was not the first time people had asked these questions. If you look at this picture from our own textbook, you can see that before sociologists, even other philosophers and people who were interested in society, including Plato, Aristotle, Confucius, all had asked these same questions. Why do people act the way they do? What sociology and other of the social sciences start to bring to this question, we will look at in a future lecture, which is the scientific method, a different way of looking at it. The Industrial Revolution had brought this new way of looking at things, using science to examine different things in the society. Generally, these questions that were being raised at the time of the Industrial Revolution went in two directions. On the individual level, which would eventually be what we know as psychology, and on the more social level, which would be sociology. But mixing between the two is a field called social psychology, which again we will look at as we continue this semester. These are the people listed in your textbook as the people whose ideas influenced the beginning of sociology. Some of these names you might recognize. Certainly Karl Marx, whose work has influenced many fields. I will walk through each, emphasizing their importance to sociology, and at the end mention a few others that were important in other countries. The first person is Auguste Comte, a French philosopher of science. One quick note about these slides. I do show the dates of birth and death for each of these people. I don't intend for you to memorize these, but I want you to see the relative time period for each. So Comte would be one of the earlier of the group of people that we're talking about. He is sometimes considered the father of sociology because he gave the name sociology to what he wanted to be a field of study. So he was the first that used the term in this way. One of the other things that you should remember about him is his endorsement or descriptions of what was called positivism. It's the belief or the use of the scientific method. Right? He believed that society and human behavior should be studied using this method. He did not use it himself because he was a philosopher, but set it as the method for the social science and then brought this use of the term sociology together with positivism to create what he hoped would be an area of study. The thing that I want to emphasize here, positivism is one thing to remember, but I want to emphasize the two questions that he asked. And these two questions remain, even today, the core of sociology. They are divided as being social statics, in other words, looking at one period of time, where he asks the question, what holds societies together? What makes them form a unique identity? The other question he asks is about change, social dynamics. He asks the question, how do societies change? So these two questions remain even today the core of sociology, the two questions that are always asked by sociologists. Harriet Martineau is one of the early women sociologists. She and others might not have called her a sociologist, as the term was not generally used during her time, and being a woman, she was not generally recognized as a scholar. But you can see from this slide and the information in your textbook how important her contributions were. First, she translated the work of Auguste Comte from French into English, introducing and making his work available to English speakers, including those in Great Britain and the United States. Also, she traveled to the United States and wrote of life there based on her observations. She wrote for various newspapers and journals, which of course were the social media of her day, while describing the social world of American society. She argued for women's rights, the abolition of slavery, and the rights of workers. Her book, Society in America, remains an insightful look at the life of everyday people in a totally new type of society. Herbert Spencer is a British writer, and like many of his day, he combined philosophy, political science, and this new study of society. After reading Darwin's work in 1859, Spencer gives us the famous words, survival of the fittest. I know we sometimes think that is Darwin, but it's actually from Herbert Spencer. He applied Darwin's idea of evolution to society, which became known as social Darwinism. His ideas were very popular, both in England and the United States. His idea that societies evolve over time was both optimistic to those going through the Industrial Revolution and classified or justified the class differences emerging from capitalism and industrialism. For example, the picture that I have up in the corner is Pittsburgh at the time. Andrew Carnegie, who had established the steel industry in Pittsburgh, Andrew Carnegie was a strong supporter of the theory of social Darwinism and the, quote, survival of the fittest, unquote, really justifying his life, how he had risen from the very poor to become the richest man in America. Spencer's idea was that societies evolved over time, from being barbaric with less social structure to the highly evolved industrial societies which develop complex social structures to meet complex needs. He believed that the study of society should be a detached scientific study without trying to change or reform society. Other thinkers disagreed with Spencer on this approach. They believed that sociology should be involved in changing society for the better, in using research to identify problems and solve them. That was the basic goal of Comte when he started this idea of positivism. He wanted there to be new reforms made to the societies. A great example of someone who wanted to change society was Karl Marx. I doubt if he thought of himself as a sociologist or an economist or any other social science which claims him. Marx saw social change as an inherent part of society. This social change he saw resulting from conflict between those who have power, that is the elite and the capitalist, and those who do not have power. He saw this relationship being determined by the economy of any period of time, what is referred to as economic determinism. In the agricultural period, for example, those who owned or controlled land belonging. This is where he uses the term alienation. In the age of industrialization, Marx saw the capitalists or owners of the factories as those having power, while the workers were captives working their lives away. He encouraged them to rebel against their owners, to claim rights and income for themselves. He also saw a belief system, what we call ideology, used by those in power to justify their position. We'll see this again when we talk about inequality and look at how Marx saw this ideology, whether a religious system or a larger cultural belief system, as justifying the power of the elite. Some sociologists picked up on Marx's idea of social conflict and followed that train of thought in explaining social life and behaviors. And as I said, we will see Marx again as we talk about social class, about deviance, many topics in sociology. The next person of this time period is Emile Durkheim, a French sociologist who held the first position, academic position, as a sociologist at a French university. Durkheim is a favorite of mine, and I consider him as the first, quote, real sociologist. He was also a strong advocate and user of the scientific method. Because of that, I'm going to hold off on talking about him. I'll discuss his use of the scientific method and his study of suicide as we cover research in Chapter 2. I will just list here some of the topics which he studied in his career. They include suicide, deviant behavior, religion, and the collective sense of community. Max Weber was another sociologist, German this time, and it is pronounced like a V, Max Weber. He also taught, at least part-time, at various universities, giving lectures which were very popular with students at the time. Weber took a more subjective approach than Durkheim. Durkheim had looked at the effect of structures of society on behavior. Weber more at ideas and how changes in ideas, our way of thinking, led to changes in social behavior and changes in society. For example, he saw the changes in religious ideas known as the Protestant Reformation, resulting in changes in other ideas, individualism being one, which led to other changes, including the economic change known as capitalism. He also saw the very rational thinking of science leading to rationalization in other areas of society, for example, in creating bureaucracies. He looked for the subjective meaning that people attached to the action of others while in a social interaction. Weber's theories and examples had great influence on one branch of American sociology because his focus was on the micro level. Remember our differences, micro, macro? Okay. Americans like that, developing not only theories on the micro level, but also the research method of survey research, which attempts to measure those subjective meanings that Weber talked about, such as attitudes and beliefs. The last European I will mention is Gregor Simmel, also a German sociologist. He is what is referred to as an anti-positivist. He disagreed with the use of the scientific method. He wanted to focus just on the smaller groups of people, maybe two people in social interaction. So he focused on small groups, maybe 2 or 3 person groups, and how interaction in these small groups happened, and of course how they changed over time. He was interested in the urban communities which were forming in the European landscape. The rural communities, of course, were being lost as the Industrial Revolution continued. His famous work was called The Stranger, which he discusses interaction with strangers, more common and different in the urban life of Europe than it had been in the rural farming communities of the pre-industrial Europe. Before long, the academic field of sociology came to American society. As usual, the East Coast took a different approach than the Midwest, which is the heartland of this new American society. I always think the two different approaches reflect the difference between establishment and those moving westward. Also the new immigrants to American society, those working their way up. In the 1880s, the first social sciences course was introduced at Harvard University, again the establishment, mainly following the work of Herbert Spencer, known as social Darwinism, that the fittest, quote, whoever the fittest are, move up in the society, which of course reflected those going to Harvard at that time. 50 years later, this more conservative Ivy League school no longer followed social Darwinism, but they did continue with the more macro or structural approach to sociology. In the Midwest, an entirely different social world, a different approach to sociology emerged, following Weber and Zemmel Moore. The University of Kansas established the first department of sociology, but Chicago became the focal point of a new school which developed a micro approach to studying communication and meanings. Just think of the many ethnic groups arriving in Chicago at that time. And so the focus became, how do these groups interact? How do you take each one of these different groups and merge them into a larger American society? This became known as the Chicago School of Sociology, and later as symbolic interaction, which is America's unique contribution to sociology. Here's a list of 3 early American sociologists. Jane Addams is referred to as the, quote, mother of social work, having established community centers for newly arriving immigrants to help both with child care of the working mothers and evening classes in English and other areas which might help these immigrants with assimilation to a new country. The next 2, W.E.B. Du Bois and George Herbert Mead, are mentioned in our textbook. Du Bois is one of the most famous Black sociologists in American sociology and among Black equal rights advocates of the early 1900s and even until today. Born in Massachusetts only 4 years after the end of the Civil War, Du Bois was always concerned with the condition of former slaves and Black Americans in general. In 1895, he was the first African American PhD to graduate from Harvard University. Throughout his life, he was an advocate for civil rights. In addition to teaching at universities and studying the life of Blacks in Philadelphia and in rural areas, in 1910, he joined a group of friends in establishing the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. He served as the newsletter editor for the NAACP for 25 years, advocating for equal rights and pointing out that race relations were the most important issue of American society. One of his most famous works is The Soul of Black Folks, published in 1903, based on his observations, interviews, and interactions with Black Americans in several regions of the southern states. The preface starts with a memorable line, quote, "Herein lie buried many things which, if read with patience, may show the strange meaning of being Black here at the dawning of the 20th century," end quote. I have listed a link. Of course, you can't get to it in this movie version. I will post this link after this lecture, after this PowerPoint is finished, but I will post it. You can read The Souls of Black Folks by going to this link, absolutely free, no charge at all. That's what's so wonderful about being able to go online. The other American sociologist I will discuss is George Herbert Mead. He was a sociologist at the University of Chicago who focused on this micro level of society. Like many in the Chicago school, he followed the general ideas of Max Weber that the way we see things is subjective. Mead went one more step, trying to figure out how the, quote, self is formed, how our perceptions, our thinking, and our actions are formed through the process of social interaction. We will discuss his ideas in more depth in Chapter 5, which is socialization, how we do develop this self that he talked about. We will see these and other American sociologists as we continue through the semester, but these give us the idea of the basis and range of sociological thinking. Some of their concepts, like social Darwinism, may even sound familiar to you. They have become part of the thinking and history of American society. This last slide is not in our textbook or any textbook that I have used, but I include this gentleman from China as an example of the global impact of sociology. I was in China in 2007, just before the Olympics, visiting different places, including universities. At several university bookstores, I saw this book, From the Soil, written by Fei Xiaotong. After researching this author, what I found was a sociologist who had played a central role in the establishment of China as we know it today. His early work described China as it had existed for thousands of years, basically a rural peasant society. He then argued for industrialization to bring China into modern society. During the early years of communism, that would be 1949 into 50s, 60s, during the early years under Mao, he was imprisoned because his work was considered too capitalistic. After Mao's death, however, China began to move more into the world than continuing to be isolated. Fei was asked to help with this effort. He was released from prison and spent the rest of his life teaching at Peking University, organizing sociology in China, and advising the central government on how to recognize and reorganize Chinese society to enter the modern age. This is a brief summary of what we talked about. I realize there are a lot of people in here to think about, but I hope this helps to summarize and organize some of the social changes that led to the development of sociology.